US-aided fighters in southern Syria were fleeing from the Syrian government's army, southward toward US-allied Israeli-controlled areas in the Golan Heights and toward America's ally Jordan, and, according to the AP's news report, the majority of these rebels in southern Syria were US and Jordan-backed, although some local al-Qaida-linked militants still operate there. The US has relied heavily upon al-Qaeda in southern Syria to lead the jihadist groups against Syria's government, ever since 2012. The expectation when Donald Trump came into the U.S. White House had been that his predecessor's war to conquer Syria, or at least to seize territory there, would end. But Trump instead continues that invasion and occupation of Syria, and he even does so under the very same excuse that Obama had used, which is the humanitarian one, of protecting people against Syria's government and against ISIS, which is one of the dozens of fundamentalist-Sunni rebel groups of jihadists who have been brought in from all over the world and financed mainly by the Sauds, and armed and advised mainly by the Americans. They've been fighting to overthrow Syria's government. The rulers of the US, who bombed Iraq and Libya to hell and have done the same to Syria and now also to Yemen, say that their motivation is humanitarian. Even George W. Bush did, when he invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003. However, perhaps now, the actual end of the invasion of Syria is, at last, in sight. The US invaders are now clearly in an untenable military strategic position in the Syrian war. Basically, it's because the al-Tanf position, US military base in Syria, is indefensible against any larger force. The US forces that can still move out without a fight. If they do not leave voluntarily, force will be used to remove them. More than 40,000 soldiers have been deployed by Syria's government in preparation for the southern offensive, according to reliable sources, suggesting that a decisive showdown is imminent. It is doubtful that the Syrian army, feeling confident after the battle for Ghouta, would launch such an operation without a green light from its Russian ally, as has been the case in similar instances. This follows the dead end reached in negotiations between Russia and the US aimed at achieving an acceptable settlement, due to the intransigence of the armed groups, their insistence on all their conditions being met and the support some receive from Israel. It is not in Israel's interest for these groups to evacuate as their counterparts did in eastern Ghouta and Aleppo, and for the Syrian army to retake control. It seems Israel is leading the US operation there. This is conceivably true, because everything that Trump has thus far done in the Middle East has served both Israel's government and Saudi Arabia's government, and both of those governments have almost identical objectives there. Conceivably, those two governments together determine what the US government's policies in the Middle East will be. And Israel has taken the initiative in Syria, just as the Sauds have taken the initiative in Yemen. But both Israel and the Sauds as well as the US regime want the Saud family to control Syria. In fact, at the UN's peace talks, in which the High Negotiations Committee negotiates against the Syrian government, to replace Syria's government, the Saud family itself selects who will and who won't be members of the High Negotiations Committee. The Syrian opposition that represents actually the Saud family. Syria continues to defy those who have spent the past 7 years conspiring against it. This time, eyes should be turned to its south, where new and shocking surprises may be in store for the Israelis and their allies. The US military base at al-Tanf, in Syria on Jordan's border, is America's main training base for the Saudi-allied rebels, and has been key to the fundamentalist-Sunni Arabic, outright jihadist, South Syrian half of America's boots-on-the-ground effort to seize Syria, or at least to seize territory in Syria. For decades, the jihadists have been hoping to oust Syria's ideologically non-sectarian, decidedly secular, government, and replace it with a Sunni Sharia law regime. Trump's troops even have been secretly arming ISIS to overthrow the government. That plan will be crashing down if these rebels in Syria's south fail. Without this jihadist operation in Syria's south, All that will remain of the US-led invasion occupation operation will be the northern part, which relies instead upon anti-Syrian government Kurds as the US regime's boots-on-the-ground proxy forces to seize the northern portion of Syrian territory. So it's the Sauds jihadists in the south, and the Americans' Kurdish independence fighters in the north, a pincer between the two, for the US alliance to take all of Syria. But there is increasing doubt that the US coalition will be able to seize and hold either portion, or, ultimately, any part, of Syria. If the southern invaders fail, then Syria's oil-producing region, around the city of Deir ez-Zor, now contested between these jihadists and Syria's government, will no longer be in play, and the only function which land seizure by the US would even possibly serve for the US and its allies, would be for pipeline construction, in order for oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and possibly other fundamentalist-Sunni-owned countries, to become pipelined through Syria into Europe, so as to replace Russia as the EU's main energy source. But Turkey's government won't permit a Syrian Kurdistan, any more than Iraq had permitted success of the US regime's plan for an Iraqi Kurdistan. The big policy difference between the Turkish government and the American government has long been over the US aristocracies, along with Israel's aristocracies, desire to use a Kurdistan so as to break up the non-Saudi Arabic countries, such as Syria, in order for Saudi oil and maybe Qatar's, the Thani families, gas to increase market share in Europe, so as to decrease Russia's market share there. Consequently, Donald Trump finally will have to do what he had always been promising to do, exit from Syria, let the Syrians control Syria. The long effort by the aristocracies of the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, to supplant Russia and its allies, as suppliers of energy and of energy-related services, such as pipeline construction, to and in the world's largest energy market, the EU, will have to be abandoned, at least until the CIA and other agencies of the US aristocracy can come up with a different way to squeeze Russia out of the European market. It's not necessarily the end for the American plan, however. A new opportunity, perhaps yet another Arab Spring, could emerge. They've been at this ever since the CIA's second coup, which occurred in Syria in 1949. When they took over Syria, but their barbarism caused Syria's generals to restore in 1955 the democratically elected Syrian president, whom President Truman's people had assisted some of Syria's generals to overthrow in 1949.